private investigator stood up in that courtroom and said 5 words that made my cousin Dexter's champagne glass shatter in his hand. The homeless man was me. That's when we all realized my billionaire Uncle Harland had been testing us for an entire year, and none of us knew we were being watched. Every conversation, every choice, every moment we thought we were alone with our true selves had been carefully documented. The man we'd all been fighting over, whose fortune we'd spent 6 months tearing each other apart to claim, had orchestrated the most elaborate test of character I'd ever witnessed. My name is Bryce Rothwell, and I'm about to tell you how my uncle's death revealed the worst and best in all of us. How a man who built an 800 million shipping empire from nothing decided that his legacy wouldn't be about money, but about a much older form of currency: human kindness. You need to understand the players in this game because Uncle Harland had been studying us all like specimens under a microscope. There was Uncle Harland himself, 74 years old when he died, a shipping magnate who started with one rusty freighter and built it into Rothwell Shipping International. The man could negotiate a deal with anyone, from Somali pirates to Senate committees, but he couldn't figure out how to tell his family he loved them without putting a dollar sign on it. Then there was Dexter, my oldest cousin at 35, a Wall Street broker who wore $3,000 suits and kept a spreadsheet of everyone who owed him favors. He'd been working at Uncle Harland's company since college, positioning himself as the crown prince of the empire. Dexter once told me that emotion was just weakness dressed up in a bow tie, and he lived by that philosophy every single day. My cousin Melinda came next, 32 years old, and sharp enough to cut glass with her ambition. She'd built herself into one of the most successful luxury real estate agents on the East Coast, the kind who sold penthouses to foreign billionaires and kept senators on speed dial. Melinda had this way of smiling that made you check your wallet afterward, just to make sure it was still there. Truman, the youngest of my cousins at 30, was the family's walking cautionary tale. He'd burned through 7 businesses and twice as many of Uncle Harland's loans, each venture more spectacularly doomed than the last. But Truman had something the others didn't: desperation so thick you could practically smell it on him, like cologne gone bad in the heat. My mother, Francine, was Uncle Harland's younger sister, though you'd never know they shared blood. Where he built empires, she built birthday cakes at her small bakery in Queens. She'd married my father, Dale, a mechanic who could fix anything with an engine but never quite figured out how to fix his relationship with the Rothwell family money machine. And then there was me, 28 years old, teaching high school chemistry to kids who mostly just wanted to know if I could cook meth like in that TV show. I was the one who'd chosen chalk dust over gold dust, lesson plans over business plans, the family disappointment who drove a 10-year-old Honda while my cousins compared yacht sizes. But here's what none of them knew as we sat in that courtroom, what Uncle Harland had hidden from all of us. He'd been dying for 2 years, his heart giving out one beat at a time, and he'd spent those final years answering a question that had haunted him since he'd made his first $1 million. The question wasn't who deserved his money. It was who deserved it the least, and the answer would destroy everything we thought we knew about each other, about him, and about what family really means when you strip away the gold plating and get down to the bone. The day Uncle Harland died, I was teaching my students about chemical reactions, how sometimes you need a catalyst to reveal what elements are really made of. I had no idea that Uncle Harland had decided to be that catalyst for his own family, that he'd already lit the fuse on an explosion that would reveal exactly what kind of people we really were when we thought nobody was watching. But somebody was watching. Somebody was always watching. And when the truth finally came out, when that investigator stood up and revealed what Uncle Harland had been planning all along, my cousins' faces didn't just go white, they went translucent, like you could see right through them to all the ugly thoughts they'd been hiding, all the cruel little calculations they'd been making while pretending to grieve. This is the story of how my uncle's final test turned his funeral into a resurrection of truth, and how the poorest member of the Rothwell family became the richest in ways that had nothing to do with numbers in a bank account. It started with a death, included a war, and ended with a revelation that changed not just who inherited the money, but what we all understood about the price of a human soul. Growing up as Harland Rothwell's nephew meant living in two different worlds. While my cousins spent summers on his yacht learning about international shipping routes and container logistics, I spent mine helping my mom at her small bakery in Queens, learning that the secret to perfect bread was patience, and that sometimes the richest conversations happened over the cheapest coffee. My Uncle Harland had built his empire moving cargo across oceans. He started with one rusty freighter in 1973, the Francine Marie, named after my mother. He'd bought it with every penny he'd saved working dock jobs, plus a loan from a shark who'd threatened to break his legs if he missed a payment. By the time I was born, he owned 200 vessels and controlled shipping routes that connected Shanghai to Seattle, Hamburg to Houston. "Your uncle could sell ice to Eskimos," my father once said while fixing our garage door, but he couldn't give away a compliment if his life depended on it. Dad was right. Uncle Harland communicated in numbers, deals, and strategic advantages. Love was a leveraged buyout. Affection was a limited partnership. Every family gathering felt like a board meeting where we were all jockeying for position, trying to prove our worth in the only currency he seemed to understand. The Thanksgiving before he died stands out in my memory like a scar. We'd gathered at his Connecticut estate, a 40-room mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. The dining room table could seat 30, but there were only 8 of us, spread out like islands in an ocean of mahogany. "Bryce doesn't have the killer instinct," Uncle Harland announced over the turkey, speaking to my mother but looking at me. "Teaching kids won't make him rich, Francine." "Maybe he doesn't want to be rich, Harland," my mother replied, her voice steady as she set down her fork. "Maybe he wants to be happy. Happiness doesn't pay for heart surgery when you're 70, he shot back, and something in his voice made me look up. There was a tremor there, barely noticeable, like a crack in a foundation you don't see until the whole house starts tilting. Dexter laughed, that practiced Wall Street laugh that sounded like money being counted. "Bryce thinks he's noble, choosing poverty, but we all know teachers who win the lottery don't go back to the classroom Monday morning." "I had a teacher who did," I said quietly. "Mrs. Goldstein won $4 million in the Powerball, came back the next semester, said she wasn't done yet." "Then she was an idiot," Melinda chimed in, examining her nails. $4 million properly invested could generate enough passive income to fund a whole school." "Or," I countered, "she understood that some things matter more than compound interest." Uncle Harland watched this exchange with those sharp gray eyes of his, the ones that could spot a bad contract clause from across the room. He didn't say anything, just cut his turkey with mechanical precision, but I caught him looking at me differently after that. Not with approval, exactly, but with curiosity, like I was a shipping route he hadn't considered before. The family gatherings always followed the same script. Dexter would detail his latest merger, the numbers getting bigger each time like he was inflating a balloon that we all knew would eventually pop. Melinda would showcase her sales, dropping names of celebrities who'd bought condos through her, each story carefully crafted to remind us that she moved in circles the rest of us could only dream about. Truman would pitch whatever business idea he'd cooked up that month, his enthusiasm inversely proportional to its actual viability. "You still driving that Honda?" Dexter asked me at what would turn out to be Uncle Harland's last 4th of July party. The fireworks hadn't started yet, but the family fireworks were already in full swing. "I could hook you up with my Ferrari. Dealer? Family discount?" "I'm good," I replied, watching Uncle Harland from across the garden. He was standing alone by the fountain, observing everyone like he always did, those sharp gray eyes taking mental notes. There was something different about him that night, a stillness that reminded me of the ocean just before a storm. "A man is not what he drives," Uncle Harland said, appearing beside us so suddenly that Dexter actually jumped. "A man is what he does when he thinks nobody is watching. It was such an unusual thing for him to say that we both just stared. Uncle Harland wasn't given to philosophy. His wisdom usually came with decimal points attached. But he just smiled, that rare smile that made him look younger, almost vulnerable, and walked away. I didn't know then that he'd already hired the private investigator. I didn't know that every interaction was being catalogued, every choice weighed and measured. I just knew that something was shifting in the family dynamic, like tectonic plates moving beneath our feet, preparing for an earthquake that would reshape everything we thought we knew about each other. The call came on a Tuesday morning during my second period chemistry class. I was explaining molecular bonds to 32 sophomores when my phone buzzed against my desk. The principal's name flashed on the screen, which meant someone was either dead or arrested. In the Rothwell family, both were equally possible. "Bryce, you need to come to my office," Principal Morrison said when I stepped into the hallway. "Your mother called. It's about your uncle." Uncle Harland had collapsed in his office at 9:47 a.m., his hand still holding a shipping contract for a new route through the Panama Canal. Massive heart attack. The cleaning lady found him slumped over his desk, and by the time the paramedics arrived, he was gone. 74 years of building an empire, and it ended between signatures on a document he'd never complete. The funeral was held at St. Catherine's Cathedral, the same church where Uncle Harland had been baptized. The shipping industry turned out in force. There were executives from Maersk and Costco, representatives from ports across 6 continents, and enough lawyers to staff a small country. The family section, however, told a different story. We sat in the front pews like actors who'd forgotten their lines, each of us performing grief while calculating percentages. "He looked peaceful," Melinda whispered to Dexter during the service, though her eyes were scanning the crowd, probably calculating the net worth per pew. "He never looked peaceful a day in his life," Dexter replied, adjusting his black Armani suit for the 4th time. "Peaceful men don't build empires." Truman sat between them, sweating despite the cathedral's cool air, his fingers drumming against his thigh in a nervous rhythm that screamed unpaid debts and last chances. My parents sat beside me, my mother crying genuine tears while my father held her hand with his oil-stained fingers, the ones he hadn't been able to scrub completely clean even for the funeral. I was the only one who'd noticed the small detail that would have mattered to Uncle Harland. They'd gotten the flowers wrong. He hated lilies, called them death flowers, but the funeral director had filled the cathedral with them. Uncle Harland had loved roses, the yellow ones from his garden that he tended himself every Sunday morning, the only thing besides his empire that he'd built with his own hands. 3 days after we put him in the ground, the family was summoned to the offices of Cromwell and Associates in downtown Manhattan. The building was one of those glass towers that scraped the sky and intimidated anyone who walked through its doors. Aldrich Cromwell had handled the Rothwell family legal affairs for 30 years, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked like he'd been born in a 3-piece suit. "Thank you all for coming," Cromwell said, gesturing for us to sit around the massive conference table. "There's been a development regarding Mr. Rothwell's estate." "Development?" Dexter leaned forward, his hands already positioned like he was about to sign something. "Just read the will, and let's get this over with." Cromwell removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly, and then delivered the words that turned our world upside down. "Mr. Rothwell's will cannot be located." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the room exploded. "That's impossible." Dexter slammed his fist on the mahogany table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. "He told me everything was in order. He promised that the company would stay in family hands. He promised me that I would be the one to lead it forward." He caught himself, but we all heard it. That sense of entitlement, that assumption that Uncle Harland's empire would flow naturally to him like water finding its level. "Without a will, the estate goes to probate," Cromwell continued, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "As Mr. Rothwell's only living relatives, You'll need to petition the court for distribution. The process could take months, possibly years." "Years?" Truman's voice cracked like a teenager's. "I can't wait years. I have creditors who won't wait years." "That's your problem," Melinda snapped, already pulling out her phone to call her lawyer. "The rest of us can afford to do this properly." The battle lines were drawn before we even left the building. Within 24 hours, Dexter had hired a team from Sherman and Sterling, the kind of lawyers who ate smaller lawyers for breakfast. Melinda brought in a forensic accountant to value every asset down to the last paperclip in Uncle Harlan's desk drawer. Truman, desperate and increasingly bitter, started making wild accusations about Dexter having undue influence over Uncle Harlan's final years, suggesting everything from forged documents to elder abuse. The war for Uncle Harlan's empire had begun, and none of us realized we were playing exactly the game he'd designed for us to play. 6 months into the legal nightmare, with lawyers bleeding the estate dry at $5,000 per billable hour, Cromwell called another emergency meeting. By then, we'd spent more on legal fees than most people earned in a lifetime, and the family dinners had turned into depositions where everything you said could and would be used against you in probate court. This time, when we entered the conference room, Cromwell wasn't alone. A woman sat beside him, probably mid-50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. She held a leather briefcase in her lap like it contained nuclear codes, and there was something about her posture that reminded me of a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. "This is Miss Nadira Voss," Cromwell announced, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone stop checking their phones. "She's a private investigator who's been employed by Mr. Rothwell's estate for the past 18 months. The math hit everyone simultaneously. 18 months. Uncle Harlan had only been dead for 6. "What kind of sick game is this?" Dexter stood up, his face flushing the dangerous red that usually preceded either a firing or a lawsuit. "You're telling me Harlan hired someone to spy on us while he was still alive?" "I'm telling you," Cromwell said, producing a sealed envelope from his safe, with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for opening Egyptian tombs, "that Mr. Rothwell anticipated this exact situation. This envelope contains his actual will, with specific instructions that it only be opened after Miss Voss completed her assignment and the family had, in his words, shown their true colors." My mother reached for my father's hand. Melinda's perfectly manicured nails dug into the leather armrest of her chair. Truman looked like he might vomit into the crystal water pitcher. And I just sat there, remembering something Uncle Harlan had told me during one of our chess games. The best move is often the one your opponent never sees coming. Cromwell broke the seal with the silver letter opener, the sound sharp as breaking bones in the silent room. He unfolded the papers inside, cleared his throat, and began to read in the same tone you'd use to announce a terminal diagnosis. "I, Harlan Marcus Rothwell, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. But first, let me tell you a story. When I was building my empire, I learned that you can judge a ship's worth not by how it handles calm seas, but by how it weathers storms. The same is true of people. So, I decided to create a storm." Cromwell paused, looked up at us over his glasses, then continued. "I leave my entire estate, all holdings, assets, and controlling interest in Rothwell Shipping International, to the family member who has demonstrated the greatest kindness, compassion, and genuine humanity over the 12 months preceding my death. Ms. Nadira Voss has been tasked with observing and documenting all interactions, both with me and with others. She has employed a team of observers, conducted surveillance, and compiled comprehensive reports on each potential beneficiary." "This is insane," Dexter's voice broke through. "You can't spy on people and call it a will. This is entrapment. It's illegal. It's perfectly legal," Cromwell interrupted. "Mr. Rothwell's fortune, Mr. Rothwell's rules. Ms. Voss, would you please share your findings?" Nadira Voss stood up slowly, like a prosecutor approaching the jury for closing arguments. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a tablet, swiping through what looked like thousands of pages of documents, photos, and video files. For the past year, my team and I have observed each of you in various situations, she began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of watching people when they thought they were alone. We've documented your interactions with service workers, homeless individuals, employees, strangers in need, and of course with Mr. Rothwell himself. She tapped the tablet, and the conference room's large screen came to life, showing surveillance footage from Uncle Harlan's office building. Every morning, for 3 months, a homeless man sat outside Rothwell Shipping headquarters. He was there from December through February, the coldest months of the year. This man was my colleague, retired NYPD Detective Ramon Fielding. The screen showed the familiar entrance to Uncle Harlan's building, the homeless man bundled in worn blankets, holding a cardboard sign that simply read, "Invisible to everyone but God." Each of you passed him multiple times, Voss continued. Your reactions were documented and analyzed. My cousins shifted in their seats like defendants waiting for a verdict. I remembered that man, remembered bringing him coffee and sandwiches on those freezing mornings when I visited Uncle Harlan for our Sunday chess games. I hadn't known anyone was watching. I'd just known that February wind cut through everything, especially hope. But that was just one test of many, Voss said, her finger hovering over the tablet like a judge over a gavel. Shall we review them all? Nadira Voss connected her tablet to the conference room screen, and suddenly we were watching ourselves through the eyes of strangers who'd been paid to judge us. The first video showed Dexter walking past the homeless man outside Rothwell Shipping, not just ignoring him, but actively stepping around him like he was toxic waste. Mr. Dexter Rothwell, Voss began, reading from her notes with clinical precision. 112 documented passes, 0 acknowledgments. On January 15th, you called security to have him removed. The temperature was 18 degrees that day. Dexter's jaw clenched. He was blocking the entrance. It was a liability issue. He was sitting 3 feet from the door, Voss countered, then swiped to the next video. On April 2nd, you instructed your secretary to lie to the Yamamoto Shipping Group about delayed payments while you closed on a $7 million vacation home in the Hamptons. On May 18th, you fired warehouse worker Dennis Kowalski 2 days before his pension vested, saving the company $40,000 and costing him his retirement. That was a performance issue, Dexter protested. Mr. Kowalski had worked for Rothwell Shipping for 19 years and 11 months, Voss stated. His performance reviews were exemplary until you needed to cut costs for your quarterly bonus. She turned to Melinda, who was already preparing her defense with the same smile she used to sell overpriced condos. Ms. Melinda Rothwell, you convinced Eleanor Patterson, an 83-year-old widow with early-stage dementia, to sell her family home in Brooklyn for 60% of market value. You then flipped it 4 months later for a $2 million profit. You donated $50,000 to charity that same month, but only after ensuring Forbes would cover the story. Business is business, Melinda said coolly, and that donation helped hundreds of children. It helped your reputation, Voss corrected. The children were just collateral benefits. When she turned to Truman, he was already shrinking into his chair like a child caught stealing candy. Mr. Truman Rothwell, you started a GoFundMe claiming to help unemployed dock workers after the Port Authority strikes. You raised $300,000. You distributed $60,000 to workers and kept the rest for what you called administrative costs. Those costs included a new Mercedes and a trip to Monaco. I was managing the fund, Truman squeaked. Management deserves compensation. However, Voss continued, her tone shifting like the weather before a storm, there was one family member whose actions stood in stark contrast to these displays of greed and callousness. She looked directly at me, and my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step going downstairs. Mr. Bryce Rothwell, every Sunday without fail, you visited your uncle. Not in his office where business was conducted, but at his home, where you played chess and listened to his stories about the early days of his business. You brought him books from your school library because he mentioned once, just once, that he missed reading fiction. The screen changed to show security footage of me entering Uncle Harlan's mansion through the service entrance, carrying a stack of worn paperbacks. But more importantly, Voss continued, your interactions with others. The homeless man outside Rothwell Shipping. You brought him coffee and a sandwich every morning when you visited your uncle. You learned his name was Ramon, remembered he was diabetic, and started bringing sugar-free cookies instead of regular ones. You didn't know he was watching. You didn't know anyone was watching. You did it because winter was cold and human beings deserved dignity. She pulled up more footage. Me at the grocery store helping an elderly woman reach items on high shelves, me tutoring students after school without pay, me shoveling my neighbor's driveway at 5 in the morning before work. The student in your class, Marcus Washington, whose family couldn't afford college application fees. You paid them from your teacher's salary, $800 that represented almost a week's pay for you. When he got into Columbia, you gave his mother your car because theirs had broken down and she needed it for work. You gave away your car? My father spoke for the first time, looking at me with surprise. It was just the Honda, I mumbled, feeling exposed like someone had turned my pockets inside out in front of the world. But the most telling incident, Voss announced, clicking to another video file, happened on September 23rd, 1 month before Mr. Rothwell's death. The security video showed Uncle Harlan's home office. He was on the floor, clutching his chest, his face purple with pain. And there I was, having arrived early for our weekly chess game, dropping my books and rushing to his side, calling 911 with one hand while loosening his collar with the other. "It's okay, Uncle Harlan," my recorded voice said, clear through the speakers. "The ambulance is coming. Just keep breathing. Remember that story about your first ship? Tell me about the storm off Cape Horn. You never finished that story." We watched as I held his hand, keeping him conscious and calm for the 12 minutes it took the paramedics to arrive, telling him stories about my students, making him laugh even as his heart struggled to keep beating. "Please, don't tell anyone about this." Uncle Harlan's voice came through, weak but clear. "If they know I'm weak, the sharks will circle." "Your secret's safe with me," I replied, "but you need to see a cardiologist." Bryce never mentioned this incident, Voss concluded. Not even when it would have proven his closeness to his uncle during the probate battle. He kept Mr. Rothwell's dignity intact at the cost of his own potential inheritance. That, ladies and gentlemen, is true kindness. Cromwell stood up from his chair with the gravity of a judge delivering a verdict. The will is clear and ironclad. The entire estate, all $800 million in assets. Rothwell Shipping International, the properties in Connecticut, Manhattan, Miami, and San Francisco, the art collection, the yacht, everything goes to Bryce Rothwell. The conference room erupted like someone had thrown a grenade into a fireworks factory. Dexter jumped to his feet so fast his chair crashed backward into the wall. "This is fraud. This is manipulation. I'll sue until there's nothing left but legal bills." "You can't buy your way into heaven." "Bryce!" Melinda screamed, her composure finally cracking like expensive china dropped on marble. "Playing Mother Teresa doesn't make you better than us." Truman just put his head in his hands and wept. The kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that came from watching your last life raft sink beneath the waves. But through all the chaos, all the shouting and threats and tears, I heard Uncle Harlan's voice in my head, something he'd told me during our final chess game, just a week before he died. "You know what I realized too late, Bryce?" he'd said, moving his knight in a pattern I'd never seen before. "I spent 50 years building an empire, but I never built a family. Your cousins see dollar signs when they look at me. Their children will inherit money, but not meaning. You're the only one who sees an old man who likes chess and detective novels, who grows roses because his mother loved them, who built ships because they were the only things that could carry him away from poverty. "Uncle Harland," I'd started to say, but he'd raised his hand. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to forget it until the time is right. Real wealth isn't what you own, it's what you give. The measure of a man isn't in his bank account, but in the lives he touches. Remember that when the time comes." Now, sitting in that conference room as my cousin's world collapsed around them, I understood what he meant. Uncle Harland hadn't just left me his money. He'd left me a responsibility and a test of my own. I stood up slowly, the words coming from somewhere deeper than thought. "I'm keeping the shipping company," I announced, my voice cutting through their protests like a ship through fog. "Those 5,000 employees deserve stable leadership, and they've earned job security, but the personal wealth, we're dividing it equally among all of us." The room went silent so fast I could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. "What?" Dexter's rage transformed into confusion, like someone had switched channels in his brain. "You heard me. 150 million each, but there are conditions." I looked at each of them in turn, seeing not the greedy relatives who'd spent 6 months tearing each other apart, but the broken children who'd grown up believing love came with price tags. "Dexter, you'll run a foundation for employees' families, especially those who lost their pensions. Melinda, you'll develop affordable housing, the kind of places where teachers and firefighters can actually afford to live. Truman, you'll manage small business grants for young entrepreneurs, real ones this time, kids who have dreams but no collateral." My mother started crying. Not the polite tears of funerals, but the messy, grateful sobs of someone watching grace in action. "And if you refuse or fail to do good with it," I continued, "your portion goes to charity. Ms. Voss has agreed to stay on retainer to monitor the programs. Not to spy, but to ensure accountability." For the first time since I'd met her, Nadira Voss smiled, a real smile that transformed her face from prosecutor to guardian angel. "You're insane," Dexter said, but there was something different in his voice, like he was seeing me for the first time. "No," I replied, "I'm Uncle Harland's nephew, and I finally understand what he was trying to teach us." 2 years later, we gathered again at the Connecticut estate, now transformed into the Rothwell Community Center. The 40-room mansion had become a place where kids learned to code, where seniors took art classes, where immigrants studied for citizenship tests in the same rooms where we'd once fought over sterling silver place settings. Dexter's foundation had sent 300 kids to college. Melinda had built housing for 1,000 families. Truman's grant program had launched 50 small businesses, including a bakery run by a Syrian refugee whose baklava was so good it made my mother cry. "You know what's funny?" Dexter said, watching kids play soccer on what used to be Uncle Harland's private tennis court. "I make less money now, but I sleep better. Haven't needed Ambien in a year." "Uncle Harland would have loved this," Melinda added, and for once there was no calculation in her voice, just truth. That morning, Cromwell had delivered one final letter from Uncle Harland, to be opened 2 years after his death. I read it to them as the sun set over the estate, painting the sky the same color as the roses Uncle Harland used to grow. "Bryce, if you're reading this, you've probably done something foolish and generous with my money. Good. You passed the real test. The first test was about finding who was kind. The second test was seeing if kindness could survive wealth. You were never the family disappointment, son. You were the only one who understood what I learned too late, that ships and money are just things, but the wake you leave in people's lives, that's what really matters. Play a game of chess for me sometime. Love, Uncle Harland. P.S. Check behind the portrait in my office." Behind his portrait was one final document, the deed to a small shipping vessel, just like the one he'd started with, registered in my name with a note. "Every empire starts with a single ship and a good heart. Keep yours." Standing there, surrounded by family who'd learned to see beyond dollar signs, I finally understood Uncle Harland's greatest gift wasn't his money. It was forcing us to discover who we really were. And in the end, we all found ourselves worthy of something more valuable than any inheritance. We found our way back to each other. The private investigator had been wrong about one thing. My cousins' faces hadn't just gone white when the truth was revealed. They'd gone transparent, then transformed, and finally, they'd gone bright with the possibility of becoming better than they'd ever imagined they could be. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about wealth and kindness, please hit that like button below. Share it with someone who needs to hear that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the lives we touch. Drop a comment telling me about a time when someone's unexpected kindness changed your life. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Remember, sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what we receive, but what we learn to give away.